spoiler alert, your customers do not care. As long as stuff is working.
I normally focus on coding chats on people who aren't working in big tech, but
Right.
you are, Nick. So you're from the dark side, shall we say?
That's right.
A
Yeah.
member of the big tech fraternity. But you've done a lot of other stuff before that, so it would be great to hear what has been your career path, and how
Sure.
did you end up at Microsoft?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll kind of go back to the beginning because I would say that honestly, like when I started off in my career, going through university, big tech was never really on my radar. And I feel like I can remember in university, I had a lot of classmates and stuff that when they were going for internships, even as early as like our first internship, and I should maybe explain this a little bit. I went to the University of Waterloo, and our engineering program there is it's called a co-op program. So every 4 months you go between school and an internship. So they start you off very early, like your first couple of weeks at university as a first year student, you are getting your resume put together. And like a lot of us, we'd never worked before. So it's like you're starting classes and they're like, get writing your resume because we're going to start reviewing them and you're going to start applying. So it's a whirlwind. But I can remember that early. I had classmates that were like, they were talking about going to Apple in particular was a big one, but we're in Ontario, Canada, and everyone is talking about going over to like Silicon Valley, like right away. And I just remember being like I don't know why everyone's so focused on that, but I'm like, I don't really care about that. Um, so from the beginning, it wasn't really a big interest for me, and I think a lot of my interest was smaller companies, and like it just has been. So going through even the internship program and stuff, it was always like if I can go to a smaller company, I don't know, like I gravitated towards it because it felt like I could have not only a bigger impact, but it would also feel like I'm uh, I don't want to say getting more hands-on attention, but it almost felt like it could be more meaningful. I think from I don't know why, but from day one, I kind of just assumed big tech, you're going to be in a cubicle, kind of like just doing mindless stuff. I don't know. This is just what I assumed, right? So it was never like I think in my upper years when I started hearing about how much the some of the internships are paying in big tech, I was like, oh, like maybe that's why there were people. If you extrapolated the salaries, I was like, that doesn't make sense for how much money these interns are getting paid. So I think that's why a lot of people were doing it. Makes sense. But it just never really stuck out for me. So I did internships at smaller companies, and in my last one, I did venture over to Silicon Valley, but it was still a startup. I still wanted to be at something small, be more meaningful. And when I graduated, it was a bit of a lucky chance, but I remember I was talking about going back to one of the internships I had in Silicon Valley, and while they were kind of going through a phase of like planning for their next quarter and stuff, I happened to get a link. It was actually a LinkedIn DM, and it was in my spam in my Gmail, and it was for a small company in Kitchener Waterloo area, and it was a digital forensics company. And I remember I went in for the interview. I was like, I have nothing to lose. Like it's okay. I might as well just do this. But it was like 8 people, startup, digital forensics, and they were already profitable. So I think for me, with no investment, so for me, it was like, hey, this is a startup, which I love. This is cool. Digital forensics sounds totally neat. They're profitable without investment. So like this seems like a good opportunity. So and it was. I hung out there for about 8 years. Um, so it's
Cool. So can I jump in there,
yeah, yeah.
Nick? A lot of people are not going to know what digital forensics is. Can you kind of
Yep.
give us a quick explanation, please?
I can, and it's funny because I had absolutely no idea what digital forensics was either. So it was like going through university and stuff. It wasn't like I'm going to graduate and I was like, "Yep, I'm going into digital forensics." Like I know this is what I'm set on. And that's a really cool thing about software engineering is like it applies to like you can think of any domain or field and you can apply software engineering to it. So digital forensics is focusing on recovering of information from digital devices. So things like cell phones, hard drives, but you can kind of extrapolate that to literally anything that's electronic that could have some potential evidence. So it could be like IoT devices, like if you had a smart microwave or like a smart uh, you know fridge, you might be able to get some data off of that to say, hey, look, someone was connected to the network at this time, or someone opened the fridge at this time. So any type of electronic device that you can recover information from to help paint a picture about what was going on during a period of time. So yeah, I focused a lot on mobile forensics for a good portion of my career there.
Cool. I'm with you on the startup. So don't really have internships, or at least we didn't when I started in this country. But I had a few holiday jobs throughout university. One was
Sure.
with a small ISP, and I love that because there were two programmers, me and the guy sat next to me, and then kind of where you appear to be now when I'm looking at the screen was the MD of the company. You know, it was that small, so I could see the big boss. I could see the most junior student there, and everybody
Right.
in the company. All we fit in one room. It was great exposure that as you say, you never get in a big company. So, what happened after digital forensics then?
Yeah, so there was a period where I remember I was interviewing. It was the move to big tech. I think I can remember basically going, okay, who's on my list? It's Google, it's Amazon, it's Microsoft, and it was just kind of this point where I'm starting to explore other things in my career. Um, Brief note in hindsight, in terms of timing, worst timing ever because I missed an IPO at this startup. I missed them getting bought back to private. So worst timing possible, but but that's
So,
okay.
not always worth chasing a big tech.
That's right. I happened to be at a startup that was basically a unicorn. So in hindsight, it's like, yeah, like if I wanted to still do exactly everything I did, if I waited 2 more years, I could have done it with a lot more flexibility. But that's okay. So we can't go back in time and change things. But do you remember going? Okay, so at that time, I hadn't interviewed for 8 years. I had been interviewing interns through, more senior level engineers, engineering managers. I was interviewing because I was there for so long. I was interviewing people that would become like, my boss and that kind of thing, right? So I had been interviewing other people for, the full 8 years, but I hadn't interviewed in forever, not since I graduated. And that interview itself was I don't want to say it was a joke, but it was one of the most easy interviews I had because the only technical question I had, which they weren't even going to ask me, when they posed it to me, I was like, just a heads up, literally, this was the same technical question I was asked in my very last um, interview for internships. So I was like, I can go do it for you, but I just want you to know, like, that I'm going to write it very quickly and I can explain it, but I'm not cheating or anything. So it was kind of a shoe in on the technical side, but going in for big tech interviews, I just remember being like, I'm not ready for this. Even though I've been programming at that time for 17 years, I had been managing teams for the full 8 years I was at that startup and was just like, buckle up because I know this is going to be very different.
Cool. So,
Yeah.
how did you change and prepare for it then? How did you find the interviews with big tech different to the startup?
Yeah. And it was interesting too because while I was interviewing for big tech, I was also interviewing for again for some U.S. companies. So that's probably the biggest shift. Wasn't just big tech; it was also U.S. companies that some of them, or I guess almost all of them, would have been they would have had investment and stuff, so they had funds to go to pay more. And certainly, the big tech ones were kind of what everyone online says. So, multiple rounds. You're going to have even for engineering managers a coding round, system design, behavioral. So for me, most of them in big tech specifically were 4 to 5 rounds. And what I found was at the EM level, it was mostly like one coding, one system design, sometimes two system design, and then the rest behavioral, which would span from like project based, like they want to hear like project management style stuff as well as leading teams and that kind of thing. But of course, if we focus more on the engineering side, I think you get fewer of the behavioral ones and just more of the coding and system design. But uh, I did what probably a lot of other people who are, super focused on big tech do. It's like get to lead code and start practicing those. And I've always say this, but I'm not a fan of lead code because I don't think that those questions are realistic for software engineering. Not that there's zero value. I just don't think that the amount of time put into them is representative of real things that you encounter from my own experience. But I remember saying, you suck at these types of problems, so start practicing. And I sat down for, day after day for weeks as I was going through and applying to companies, and just carved out a couple hours every day to practice lead code as well as system design, because I had been building systems, but a lot of them were desktop based applications. So we would be talking about more software architecture in a, call it like a monolith, right? Because it wasn't even web based. A lot of stuff in digital forensics, this is a sort of a limiting thing, is going to be air gapped. So the investigators would not have internet connections a lot of the time to their forensic workstations. And that's because they're dealing with very sensitive information, sometimes things like child pornography and things like that. So they're trying to keep it very isolated to a machine. And that way there's no risk of anything going on. So from a architectural perspective, it made it when I was interviewing, I'm like, I understand these concepts, but I'm actually out of practice with probably a lot of cloud computing and distributed computing concepts that people are going to be expecting. So also had to brush up on those types of things. So was watching YouTube videos, basically making my own problems, and I would sit there and I would say, okay, here's a timer for 30 minutes, and kind of leaving the question open ended. And when you're interviewing yourself for this type of stuff, I would basically introduce different constraints to the problem. So I would start it and then I would say, okay, for this time, you're going to be optimizing for latency, or this time you're going to be making sure that you have this unique constraint. So how would you go change the system? And I would talk it out loud. I would write it down, draw pictures. But between that and lead code, those are the biggest things, because the behavioral things, as someone focused on as an engineering manager, I was like, that stuff just comes to me very quickly.
So let's dig into that a bit then.
Sure.
I see a lot of software engineers that the behavioral stuff doesn't come that easily. Soft skills are weak. Their approach is, we say, very logical, rational, very unemotional, and quite often don't appreciate how important those soft skills are. So, if they didn't come naturally, how might you have approached them, or what advice would you give to somebody that doesn't have them, say, come naturally?
Yeah, and I should probably, mention that I feel very fortunate that from being at startups, it was like almost you're forced into conversations. You were kind of mentioning earlier, like you can remember like being in a small room like I'm in and being able to turn and like, the founder or the CEO, the CTO, they're right there. You can talk to, different levels, different stakeholders, the engineers that are there with you, around you. Um, and I feel that, at least in my experience, the small companies exposed me to that and kind of forced me into a situation where I needed to be working closely with all sorts of different roles. And then the side effect of that is that you need to be practicing communicating. So what I would encourage to other people, I mean, if you're at startups, you're probably experiencing something like this. But even if you're not, if say you're at a bigger company, I would say as much as possible, try it and make sure that you are engaging in discussions. Uh, make time to go. If you have, it's hard to kind of generalize this kind of thing if you don't know a team structure, but make time with your project manager, make time with your product manager, sit down with the UX designer, whoever, like think about these different roles and carve out time to go meet with them, understand them, put yourself in their shoes, understand what they need, and truly like make an effort to go practice this stuff, because if it feels uncomfortable to you, you end up avoiding it. And when you avoid things, you don't practice them, And then you have this vicious cycle of being like, I don't like that thing, I'm also not good at it, and you just keep avoiding and keep not getting better. So kind of take that initial step and change the cycle, right? It's uncomfortable, I'm going to start trying it out, and you'll quickly realize that once you start practicing, it's you're just talking with other humans and we're all just trying to get the same thing done.
Absolutely. One of the things I've tried to do a few times in that situation, at the bigger companies at least, is to try and find a mentor that's one or two levels above me, and perhaps not directly, so not skip level, but
Right.
that kind of level, but maybe an adjacent area. So you've got, you're building your network out in that area. You're getting some feedback from people who are perhaps more senior, got different insights into the business. So I found that quite useful, and that really helps.
Yeah, it's lots of opportunities, but you have to kind of go out of your way if you're sitting there, like if you're listening or watching this and you're like, okay, well, I'm at a company, there's people around me, but like I'm not having these interactions. It's like, yeah, but there's the people around you. Like if you be proactive about it, you can create those interactions, and you should, because if you're not practicing them, it's not going to get easier.
Yeah, especially as more as work remotely, and it gets harder to have that kind of bumping into somebody in there. When I worked in the office, it was quite easy to bump into somebody in senior management. Even I think my second job, there were about 300 people. I was in the head office, but there was still one kitchen. So the MD went and got his coffee at the same place where I did. So you could bump into some of the directors,
Yep.
some of the people that founded the business, some of the people that came to board meetings, and just say hello, start talking to them, asking questions about how it was. Again, when everyone works in Slack, that's a little bit harder. You got any recommendations for people dealing with that?
Yeah, this is so such a good reminder too, because it's like as I'm talking to you about my I was at these startups and stuff. Yeah, very different world. I switched to big tech at the exact same time that the world shut down. So I transitioned into the big one of the biggest companies in the world now, not the biggest. After the last couple days, um, and at the same time went fully remote, which was like two very very big changes. But so thank you for the reminder. But yeah, everything you just kind of called out about these experiences where you can bump into like executives and things like that. Even when I was working at the digital forensics company, the sales and marketing team was on the floor above us in the office that we had, and the kitchen is on the main floor. So, even the CEO would come down and walk through sometimes. And, I knew him since the beginning, and, come by and have small talk and stuff like that. So those in office experiences, I feel like, are extremely difficult to replicate. Um, I've noticed even going back to for a little bit of hybrid right now. My team doesn't force it, but my team actually a lot of them do go into the office a couple days a week, and it's nice because I can go drop in and get some FaceTime and stuff. That stuff's really valuable, and working fully remote can be very difficult. Um, I've noticed in particular with more junior engineers, reaching out to more senior people asking for help is seems extremely difficult. People don't want to bother other people. Again, especially if they're more junior, and I hate to say it, but some people say like, I don't want to sound stupid asking questions, and it's like you're not. Like people on the team want to help you, and I just really encourage people to, again, like if you're not getting those interactions, like make time for them, right? You could propose to your team even, could we do a weekly, bi-weekly virtual hangout? Like, can we, you want to work with your team to come up with these opportunities, like kind of help shape the culture of your team to encourage more communication, because when everyone's remote, it can be extremely isolating. So those are a couple things that I've thought of.
Yeah, I had that experience towards the end of the first year of the pandemic. I was doing a contract for a company in the UK, and to this day, I only know what one person on that team looks like.
Wow.
I was there for 8 months doing this contract until they launched the product. Everything was done over Slack. They had a daily stand up, but everybody did it with their videos off, and none of them had a little picture, so they just had avatars or pictures of minions and stuff on Slack as their IDs.
Maybe
So
those were their pictures.
I only know one of them looks like, because they sent me an invite after I left to connect on LinkedIn, and they had a real photo on LinkedIn. So I found that unbelievable. I mean, I'm an introvert. I don't really like meeting people, and I'm quite happy being remote. And so I'm quite happy not being in big crowds. But it's nice to know what the people you work with actually look like. I mean, I was look them in
Yep.
the eye, even if it's virtually, and see they're smiling. And it was a bizarre experience. And as you can imagine, not really much for team feel. They were all kind of
Right.
bonding and not much collaboration going on that I saw. Okay, cool. So how has it worked then coming into big tech, which is a completely different size at the beginning of the pandemic when you haven't presumably managed people remotely before? How did that change
Right.
your management style? What were the three pain points you had and three lessons that you learned from that?
Yep. Great question. So yeah, the double whammy of big tech now being remote. I would say the third part is not only remote, but distributed teams as well. So this would have been the first time where not only was I managing people that were in a different time zone, but it was multiple time zones. So it was I was in Eastern time zone, so I was in Ontario, Canada to start. I started during the pandemic. My job offer was for the US, but they were like, look, we're not going to force you to relocate because we get everything is super weird right now. So they're like, when you're ready, when it makes sense, come down. So I started in Canada. A lot of the team was in Pacific time. And I also had engineers that were in Mexico. So this was the first time I had individuals in a different the US is a different country than Canada, but I mean, like, just even a bigger culture change as well. Didn't have direct reports, but what we call like a dotted line report. So they would have their own engineering manager from like a coordination and project perspective. I would have been their manager on that front. So I had engineers in Suzhou, China. So again, like another very huge kind of mix into into everything that I was doing. So yeah, a bunch of stuff had to kind of evolve. One was that, I guess, to start, when I worked in the digital forensics company, I was there since the beginning. So the founder had some software that he created. He was a police officer, and kind of right in the beginning, it was like we were rewriting it because he was like, "Look, I know how to do some basic programming. I knew how to get this up and running, but like that's why you guys are here. Like, let's let's make this a real thing." So I was there since the start, knew all of the code. I was teaching people about refactoring the legacy code, which was my code by the time I was leaving. But joining Microsoft, it was like this stuff is old. Like some of the code is older than people on the team. So I I felt like as an engineering manager, I lost what I considered to be one of my superpowers, which was I feel like I can relate very much with the people on my team because if we need to talk about code, like at any level people want to get into, I'm like happy to do it. I know we should be prioritizing our team, talking about career, things like that. But if people were like, hey, I just want, like, I'm stuck in this code, like, I need help. I'm like, no problem. Like, I might have written the stuff that you're trying to, that you're trying to make work. So, I lost all that. And that was something I leaned on very heavily. And I needed to switch up my style and say, look, like, as an engineering manager, you are more than just your ability to program. So this was like kind of one of the first really big moments where I didn't have that to lean on, but what I could still tap into there was Microsoft uses C sharp. I've been using C sharp, like I said, at that point. I've been programming for 17 years, but I can't do the math on the fly, but a good chunk of that would have been in C sharp. So could still lean into it, but not the domain, right? The domain I had no experience with. I didn't know the code base. So at least for some of the more junior people, I could say, hey, look, if you, and a lot of them didn't know C sharp coming into Microsoft. So I could say, look, I know you're learning a new language. I happen to know this language quite well. So, just a heads up, you can rely on me if you need some extra help and stuff. So kind of in terms of management styles and how I had to shift, it was a lot more like explicitly trying to be transparent, explicitly trying to reach out and communicate, like just over communicating and trying to kind of put things out there for people, not just waiting. And I think that's something that I would really encourage others to kind of focus on if you are remote, is this idea that if everyone's kind of being more passive and saying like, I'll just wait for someone to reach out, uh, everyone else is doing that too. So you have a lot of like a stalemate situation where everyone's just kind of waiting and being passive. But I think there's a lot of opportunity where we can be proactive.
So that reminds me of my last role, which I left in March, and I I did what you described. I put a lot of stuff out there, new to the business, asked a lot of questions, and at times it felt like posting into the void.
Yep.
Stick stuff on a Slack channel, ask questions, make an introduction. Nothing. Silence. What's been your approach to tackling that?
Yeah, and it's interesting too because I think there's a handful of things that, in my experience, that were kind of stacking up and making that kind of weird. So, in hindsight, I think that like if I reflect on the culture, so at Microsoft, I'm in a side of Microsoft called Office 365, or Substrate is kind of the sort of the technology we talk about is the infrastructure for all of Office 365. So as I talk, I might use them interchangeably. So in Substrate, a lot of it is centered around Exchange, the email server. That's like some of the core technology that powers all of it. So in Exchange, being an email server, you might imagine that the people that have been around there for a long time, one of the most popular ways to communicate is over email. So there is a huge email culture, but I would say a lot of the people coming in that are younger or junior, email is not a huge part of their culture. One of the biggest ways that they communicate is instant messenger. And they're just more common, or sorry, more comfortable, not common, more comfortable talking in chat and stuff like that. And you could like I said, in hindsight, it's kind of funny to think about, but I think people were probably waiting for the chats to pick up, and this is how they're used to working. But everything was like, go to email for this, like put it in the email. That's where people are talking. And I kind of had a similar experience that you described, where you're trying to put stuff into the chat, and it kind of feels like, you're like, okay, I put it out there. Why isn't this working? I think probably what I should have done is encouraged the people on the team, especially the newer folks, to lean into the ways that they're more comfortable communicating. So I think it took over like 2 years for someone on the team to post a meme in the chat. And it sounds like a very small thing, right? Like, okay, you're working at a tech company. Why do you need memes and GIFs and stuff like that? But the place I was at before, one of the most fun things was like we had custom GIFs and memes and stuff that we could have in our Slack channel, and they became part of the culture for communicating. And it's I think I should have just leaned into encouraging people, like, if chat is your more comfortable way to communicate, like, it's okay, please do that. I think it's important to be, even though it feels like you're talking to the void, like, keep doing it, because you need to help shape the culture, show other people that if that's how they are comfortable communicating. In my case, that's what it was. I'm not saying that's the case all the time, but I should have maybe leaned into that a little bit more with my team and in one-on-ones, and said, you know, if I'm noticing that I'm like, it feels like I'm talking to the void, maybe kind of surveyed the team a little bit in one-on-ones and said like, hey, like, what do you like? How are you finding like getting in touch with people on the team? Like, what do you prefer? And then if they were like, maybe chat, but no one seems to use Teams that way, then I could say, hey, like, no, it's cool. Like, how could we make that better? Just get them to lean into it so that they get the momentum of having those interactions, because I think they probably felt like there was a barrier, some invisible barrier, but they're like, only the manager's doing it. Like, it's kind of weird. I don't know.
I kind of want to have a dig there, just so I'm going to anyway. The obvious answer is get off Teams and use Slack. Teams sucks.
It's very different internally at Microsoft. It's really funny. If I have to use Teams outside of Microsoft, sometimes I go, "Oh, this is why people don't like using it." And I don't know. I can't put my finger on like what features are missing or what's different about the user experience. But when I use Teams at work, it feels great, even though we're on like what we call like the dog food ring, where we have like, the latest version. It's broken half the time because there's always changes and stuff. But even when it's broken, it still feels fine to use. Sometimes there's quirks, but outside of work, I'm like, man, like, yeah, put me on Slack.
Yeah,
don't
it's not my favorite bit of
edit that
software.
out.
um, I forgot what I was going to say now. Yeah, so what I was going to say, one of the things that I've done a few times when I've been managing teams, which I wasn't in the last role, is we've had that discussion within the team of what are our norms, what's our preferred way of communicating, and we've done things like how do we prefer to communicate, and not everyone's going to agree, and it's not going to align with everyone, but we've tried to go with what suited the majority. We've also had team norms around when are we going to have our meetings, when are we going to try and
Yep.
have a meeting free day. Have you tried any of that in your team, and how well has that worked?
Yeah, we did this a lot with meetings for sure, and that was sort of an ongoing thing. I should add in one of my biggest like management philosophies. People will say like, oh, like so, at startups, were you doing agile or big tech? Do you still do agile? Like, agile. So I always say like I try not to label things any particular way, but I focus on like just continuous improvement. So however that shapes up to be, as long as we are continuously trying things, experimenting, and then saying if it's working or not. If it ends up looking more like Kanban versus Scrum, or if it happens to start shifting more to like a waterfall method, because that's just the way that, as we continue to experiment, it pushes us that way. Ultimately, I just say continuous improvement, but I apply that to things like meetings, communication styles, team norms, especially because that kind of stuff will evolve over time as the team is changing. Um, Changing, and even with the same people on the team, they might start getting more comfortable. Their working patterns and projects might start shifting. So it's always, in my opinion, a good thing to focus on just how do we keep trying to get better. So norms in terms of meetings, I would say we had a handful of different things we like to look at, not to just make meetings for the sake of meetings, but one example of a really good or interesting meeting that we had was our team structure. We had one very, very, very experienced engineer. He'd been at Microsoft for 25 years, had been in our area for a very long time. He knew it was kind of like, if I reflect on my experience at the digital forensics company, I think he had like that kind of thing going on, but even longer and in a code base that was even bigger. So uh, he knew everything. And if he didn't know it, he could go look in the code and be like, oh yeah, that like I remember now from, however many years ago. So he was like the historian on the team, right? Excellent engineer, but also could act as a historian. And a lot of the people on the team were very new and very junior, which is totally fine. But we had this huge split in terms of experience. So we ended up having like a recurring meeting that we could basically we could lean into his experience on the team, dive into different code areas so that everyone on the team could learn. So if he was spending time with an individual and they were talking about some area of the code, we could actually say, hey, look, this would be a good conversation for other people on the team to see this. So could you schedule, like, in that slot that was recurring, could you schedule some time just to, like, you don't need a slideshow, but like could you just kind of organize some thoughts and walk us through together? So that was like a team norm that we had. And similar to that, when we have to do live site investigations, because it's a huge I didn't mention this part, but I was on the deployment team for Office 365. So by the time I left, I inherited a second deployment team. I switched teams. I didn't leave Microsoft. So I had two deployment teams, and between the two, we were responsible for deploying literally like hundreds of services for all of Office 365. And as you might imagine, like making sure that things are operational, like the live site perspective is a huge part of that. So we would also use that meeting slot for diving into like investigations. So if someone was on call and they had something that they had to go investigate, like we could use that time for people on the team to share, hey, here's how I went and solved this. Here's where I documented it, but like this is a good opportunity for you to ask questions. But that kind of thing was a team kind of norm that we created based on feedback, where people were like, I need, like, I'm not picking up on some of these things quick enough. Like, can we do a better job? So just one example of that.
Cool. My pen's dried up. I was going to go back to what you said earlier, that some of that
Sure.
code that you have is older than people on the team. I've written on LinkedIn a few times about this, that when you maintain code, you get a completely different perspective of what good code is. When you look at
Yeah.
code that's been around for 25, 30 years, and it's worked for all that time, it's quite easy to say this is rubbish code, or why the hell would you have written it in that language? But the flip side, it's been around for 25, 30 years. It's been creating value for the organization for all of that time. We don't know usually the context of why it was written that way, what went into it. But again, it's been valuable for all that time. What lessons do you think that people have gained as they've been very junior and new, facing that code that's perhaps older than they are?
Yeah. And it's funny, when I was at the startup, so like you said, you're introverted. I'm very, very introverted. Maybe with the YouTube stuff over the past year and a bit, I've been trying to come out of that shell. So I present myself as less introverted. But even before going to Microsoft, so I had mentioned that I ended up being the person who had created a lot of the legacy code at the startup. And probably the last 2 years I was there, I started to do a presentation, which was wildly uncomfortable for me, but it felt like I felt it was extremely important. And you took the words like right out of my mouth when you said, like, why the hell would we have written it this way? And basically my entire presentation was explaining that, and it was meant to be not just for the engineers, but even for people in sales and marketing, because some of the processes that we would have in place, even outside of engineering or outside of code, people coming in to a company might say, like, why the hell is it this way? And my framing for that was always, I highly encourage people to be curious, to ask questions, because it's important to understand why it is that way, and not just why the hell is it that way because you're making fun of it, because the context is everything. So, yeah, I used to give this talk about giving examples of, like, here's why we wrote code this way, and here's literally the context around it. So now you know. And then I could give them snapshots over time of, like, we changed it to be like this, or we changed this process to be like this. And when you have the context around that, you go, oh, yeah, that makes sense. But then you see it evolve and you go, oh man, like, I could understand that with that shift of context, why this previous way would have been completely ridiculous. So just kind of the talk was about giving people this reminder that, like, given the context, you can probably rationalize that people were doing what they thought was the best thing to do at that point in time. So yeah, I just encourage people to understand where that comes from. But what you had mentioned about, this code that's been around for a long time, like, I think a lot of people, fresh on the job, maybe they're fresh out of school or whatever it happens to be, they're used to seeing code that is perfect, right? Like, they're watching tutorials or learning about things, and it's like, here's a design pattern, clean cut, copy paste, like, here's how you do it. And then they get into the job and they're like, what is this? Like, this isn't what they said in the books. And it's like, yeah, surprise. Like, and these are the constraints you have to work in, because your first thing that you're doing is not, let me highlight all of it, delete it, and start from scratch, because there's a business to run and that code is working.
Which brings us nicely to, I see a lot of people, why don't Microsoft just rewrite Windows in Rust or whatever? And it's like, have you any idea how much effort went into building and testing that software? And again, I've never worked at big tech, probably never will, but I've worked at a few financial institutions that have been around 30, 40 years, and they still have millions of lines of legacy code, some of which, I looked at one thing in the financial pricing system, was written in TCL, and the code was last changed 25 years before I joined the company, but it worked. It did the job. And
Right.
no one was going to go and rewrite that because, yeah, TCL is an interpreted scripting language. It's slow, but it was fast enough. And the risk of
Mm-hmm.
changing it and losing millions on a financial transaction because you introduced a bug was just way too high to consider rewriting it. And it
Yep.
probably still hasn't been rewritten.
Yep. It's I think people, again, I feel very fortunate to have gone through startups, and uh probably those close interactions with other stakeholders and stuff, it's like you you realize that there is a business that needs to stay afloat, and you can see the impact of like, I remember people making decisions where we rewrote things. And I remember the meetings going into the meetings where we were like, look, we're debating if we're going to rewrite this. And those going on for like, a month where we were debating back and forth about pros and cons. And, you know, like, there's a couple times where we did rewrite things. And every time it was like, this is going to introduce so much risk, so much uncertainty. And I no, I a lot of the time I was not in agreement with rewriting. I think that there's ways that you can rewrite portions of things. I think the popularized term is like, from Martin Fowler's, like a strangler fig, where you basically rewrite portions of things and start replacing them slowly over time. Um, but like, the big rewrites and stuff to get rid of like legacy code because you're going to do it right this time, uh, man, from a business continuity perspective and being able to ship value to customers, spoiler alert, your customers do not care. As long as stuff is working, they're getting value, they continue to get value, they don't care what language it's in.
Yeah. And every single big relight I've seen like that has failed. And about half of them have taken the company down with it.
Yeah,
So I would just never do a relight these days. As you say, strangle
it's
fig and other
incredible
ways. Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like
And
we
what
got
you've got to remember
super
is,
lucky that it worked.
yeah, but the thing you've got to remember is if you're in a position to consider a relight, it's because you have customers and they're
Yes.
paying for the product because they get value from it. So anything you do risks destroying that value stream. And if your customers leave, you have no business. So it doesn't matter how good the quality of the software is when the company's gone.
Yeah. There's just these other constraints that I feel like a lot of people generally don't think about, unless they had to experience, unless you felt and I'm generalizing here, but I feel like unless you have felt responsible, like, for keeping the customers, if you're just like, hey, like, we have customers, they just happen to be here, then you're not really going to feel that impact of like, of getting your code shipped in on time, like with high value, because like that's what's keeping the customers there. And if you're just like, hey, the business has customers, they always have, I can just do things and clean up the code like 100% of the time. It's like, it just doesn't work that way.
Yeah, I've had two parts of my career. The first was that very first job I had as a student, working for one of the UK's first ISPs. And it got to the point where the MD basically said to us, look, if we don't get some new customers in the next 2 weeks, we're out of business. We're stuffed. So we need to do some marketing. And marketing in those days was stick a CD in an envelope and post it to people.
Yep.
It's like, we need to send out at least 10,000 CDs today in the post and hopefully get like 100 new customers from that to all keep our jobs. There's 10,000 envelopes. Everybody dig in. So we all stopped and we all stuffed envelopes until they were done because
Right.
we might not have had a business. And that brought it home to you that, software doesn't matter. And I was building simple software as a student there in my university holiday. So it was beer money for me. It didn't really matter, but it was very real for the people there. This was their livelihood. They had a nice work environment. They worked for a good company. So we got down and we stuffed envelopes until they got out the door. And we got enough customers to keep going till next month when the next crisis hit. And then a few years after I'd actually started my career properly, I started my own business. And there, so I had to learn to sell, I had to learn to market, because without customers, you're not anywhere. Once you've got
Yeah.
the customers, it's a case of like, we're building software for other people. We get paid when they accept it, when they start using the software.
Right.
So I can gold plate it and they can have it in 6 months' time and they're annoyed. Or we can make it good enough and they get it in 2 months when they want it, they start getting value from it and we get paid and we get to eat.
Yep.
So that changed my perspective on things. So I still like to build good quality software, but I'm aware of that trade-off and I've been painfully aware of it at times when I was like, can I eat tonight? Focuses the mind a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. Just different sets of constraints, right? And I feel that, again, I can't speak for everyone, but I feel like there's a lot of people that have never been in similar situations and almost take it for granted that like the business just keeps running, right? Because we're here, we're sitting at our desks, or we're working remote. We're writing the code, therefore the business continues to run, and it's like not quite,
Yeah,
not quite.
again, a few years later, or many years later, I was an executive at a VC-backed startup, and I had people getting really upset with me as I was VP engineering, going, "We need to do like this," and I'm like, "No, I've just come out of a meeting which I can't tell you about. Well, I know we can't make payroll in 2 weeks' time. I'm focusing on how do I help bring forward an invoice so we can make payroll and we all still get paid at the end of the month. Relighting is not even on the horizon because I'm trying to stop people being laid off and make sure we all get to take a paycheck home. Gives you a different perspective. Okay,
Absolutely.
pivoting slightly. I wanted to pick your brains about mentoring. What's been your experience of mentoring throughout your career? Has it differed at startups versus at Microsoft?
So great question. And I was talking with someone about this last night actually, and they said, "Hey, they're a student in the university that I went to, and they were asking me like, how impactful was mentoring in your career?" And I said, unfortunately, I never took on a mentor, and it's one of those things in hindsight where I'm like, ah, man, I probably should have done that. It's not too late for me either, but I'm still kind of like, I haven't done it, and I. It sounds like I'm being a hypocrite, but I do highly recommend people find some type of mentorship. I think that it's important that if you're looking for a mentor, you find someone that you look up to, and not just you see a service online or something and someone's offering mentorship and you're just like, there it is, okay, I'll just sign up and pay for it. Because the time that you spend with your mentor is going to hopefully be shaping the way that you approach things, and you want to make sure that you're getting that from someone that you look up to and respect. But this can look all sorts of different ways. So the part that I'll comment on is that I never had a mentor and I still don't. So I don't have a lot of advice to offer from the perspective of here's my experience being mentored. But I have done a lot on the exact opposite side, and that has stemmed from like one of the things that fulfills me is being able to help other people kind of break through obstacles and stuff like that. So I would say like mentorship can come in all different shapes and sizes. So it does not have to be you go online and search for how to find a paid mentor. It could be a peer. It could be someone on a different team. They don't have to necessarily be levels above you. I would recommend that if you are you kind of approaching this, that it would be good to find someone that is maybe a couple steps ahead of where you'd like to be. But the reason I say it doesn't have to be is there's an interesting program at Microsoft called reverse mentorship, which sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's really cool because as a principal engineering manager, I was paired up with someone who was levels below me in a different role entirely, and the reverse mentorship was really just about here's different perspective on things. So I think mentorship in general is this interesting opportunity to find different perspectives, and that's probably the biggest value add is that you have these different perspectives that you can hear about. And when you're in your own bubble, kind of feeling like you're stuck, maybe could be about a bunch of different things, progression in career. Um, Maybe you're having challenges kind of working on your team or, progressing through some different technologies and stuff. Having someone that you can look up to and just give you different perspective, I think is a huge value add. So I have been trying to do that part where I'm going, hey, look, like if I can help make a difference for other people, whatever that looks like for them, then I want to play that role. But I should take my own advice, I think, and probably seek out someone who I'm like, wow, like that person's awesome. Like I would love to like learn from them and kind of see what I could do to move myself in that direction.
Cool. I'm going to add something to that as well. It doesn't
Sure.
have to be one person. You can have multiple
Yeah.
mentors. You could, as you say, do that reverse mentorship with somebody in sales and learn about sales and their complete perspective on it, while having maybe somebody at skip level in the technology organization and getting engineering and sales and two different perspectives. Or, go wild and have three different mentors. You could pursue it in different ways. The other aspect I wanted to touch on is I've always encouraged the engineers that work for me when I've been leading a team to mentor people below them, because I think it's a
Hmm.
crucial part of your own personal development to be able to help those couple of steps behind you. You learn a bit more about what you're doing and you get a better understanding of it if you have to then explain it to other people. You
Right.
learn the struggles and the challenges that they're facing, and you help develop them and lift them up, and kind of get that 10x effect. If you can make 10 junior people twice as effective, you've created 10 times the value that they were doing before. Do you encourage the people in your team that are working for you to mentor others, and do you provide any structure and support for them doing that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny because I've talked about this before, where it's like if you, especially if you haven't led teams before, or say you're very new to the industry, if you were to say, well, what does an ideal team look like? Someone might say, well, you just pick the highest level engineers and jam them onto a team because they'll obviously do the best work. And it's like maybe for a project, but like not from like a not from like an overall team health perspective. I'd say you actually do want a spread of different levels and obviously backgrounds and different skill sets and stuff. But the level part I think is important, and it's because it provides that opportunity for people to be able to help coach and mentor those that are a couple steps behind them. So uh, the advice I give to people kind of shifts from different levels, but it's all similar, right? You do want to be able to try and help those that are a couple steps behind. So for very junior individuals, even for them, there's opportunities to help mentor and stuff. So I've been for Microsoft, for example, I've been on two teams now where as I was hired, there were other people hired on at the same time that are new to the company, junior maybe. Sometimes it's their first job, and I'm like, hey, look, you can actually help the other people that are onboarding with you. Right, here's just an opportunity to help others, and trying to instill that very early, that if you help others, like, you do have a multiplier effect. So even at the very junior level, here's an opportunity. And then as you get a little bit more senior, it could be, hey, look, these people are onboarding, help them. Uh, there's been instances where we have interns come on. And I think having interns coming onto a team is a great opportunity for people that maybe aren't super junior because they're still trying to navigate, but someone who has a little bit more experience. It's like, hey, you can go help this brand new person. They don't know anything about what we're doing. Like, you can really help kind of shape their experience for them. So I've had people kind of jump into that. And then as you get more senior, um, in my opinion, and I think this is reflected at least at Microsoft. It will vary from company to company, of course, but the more senior you are as an engineer, sorry, losing my words, more senior you are as an engineer, the the more expectation there is, not only that the impact you're having from a deliverable perspective is bigger, but also your circle of influence is growing. And that can mean that when you are helping people, say like the step behind you, it's almost like a broader reach. So you're helping maybe the whole team that you're on try to get up to speed on things. So just this bigger and bigger impact as you become more and more senior.
You mentioned kind of teams of all senior people there.
Yeah.
I think that sounds like a terrible idea. And I've never understood the kind of companies that talk about doing it because, and I've never experienced it, but I imagine a team of all senior people. How do they get used to mentoring other people? There's nobody junior to mentor,
Right.
so you've deprived them of a growth opportunity. And then also in most projects, there's a range of different work,
Hmm.
from the kind of dull, repetitive work that, okay, we'll knuckle down and do. But if a senior engineer is only ever getting that and never getting stretched, they're going to be looking for growth opportunities where I'm not saying you give the boring work to a junior, but for a junior, that would be a stretch. Perhaps it would be a growth
Yep.
opportunity where for the senior, it would be potentially dull. So I think teams of just senior people are a really bad idea, and I don't see it working.
Fully agreed. Yep. For
Cool.
those exact reasons. Yeah.
So let's pivot then. You mentioned YouTube as well. You've been doing YouTube, putting out a newsletter. You've been doing a lot of content creation recently. Let's hear about that. Who are you looking to help?
Sure.
What's the mission there?
Yeah, and it's actually been a very long journey, but I took a very long break in the middle. So the reason I started doing what I'm doing for content creation is because uh, early on in my career, when I became an engineering manager, it was like I was a few months into working at that startup I mentioned, and it's a startup, it's going to grow. And I remember them saying to me, hey, do you want to try leading one of the teams? Because you seem to be able to talk to the engineers pretty well. Like that's how it started. And I was like, I have no idea what that means, but like, sure, if it's going to be helpful, sure, like I'm happy to do it, right? And that kind of put me on this path of being an engineering manager from very early on. And I remember being like, I have no idea what I'm doing, as you might expect. I'm fresh out of school, and what's really common, unfortunately, for engineering managers is like there's not a lot of formal training. Almost ever is there formal training you get put through. Just like here's a title, here's your responsibilities, go have fun, don't mess it up. So for me, it was like I started my dev leader kind of personal brand as a blog to just try and share with people what I was learning. So it was very much a learn in public kind of thing. Like I'm going to try to read all these resources. So a lot of my original blogs were just like I've collected a bunch of stuff, here's some thoughts on it, and I'd send it out. So I started doing this in 2013. So yeah, it's been a while.
Wow.
um
Wow.
but I gave up on it because I was doing it and I'm like, why? Like I wasn't getting feedback. There was no feedback loop on it. And I think I started to realize it's a lot of work to create content. And part of me was expecting that there would be this feedback loop where people were like, "Oh, this is helpful. Thank you so much." And I would go, "Oh, cool. Like I'll keep doing it." But it wasn't happening, so I was like, like is it worth the time? So I did give up on it. And the reason that so in 2023, kind of it was at the tail end of 2022, I remember seeing like really successful YouTubers putting up programming videos, helping educate people. And the, this might sound like backhanded, I guess, but I remember watching them and being like, they're so successful at this. And I'm not minimizing the effort, their skill, or anything else, but just remember watching and being like, I think that I can do this. Like, I don't think that they have a superpower that is something that I'm not able to do. And like I said, I know that might sound backhanded. I think they're incredibly talented. I know it's a lot of work, but I was like, I think that if I stay consistent with this, this is something that I could add value in and see success doing it. So I made it my goal in 2023. I said, you're putting out 3 YouTube videos a week. Go for it. And yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think I can imagine that some people might take what you said wrong, but I think actually you've hit on a really important point that most of us need to realise, and most of us really need to internalise and take to heart, is that everybody has the same 24 hours in a day. We all need to eat, we all need to sleep, we all need to use the bathroom. Most of us are distinctly average, for lack of a better word. The difference between you and those YouTubers, or I don't know, me and say somebody who's running a more successful podcast, it's that consistency. It's that
Yeah.
decision to, I'm going to start and then I'm going to stick with it. And I'm going to get that 1.5%, 2% better each week, month, whatever. And again, you pick out those successful YouTubers, and I bet you find they started 10 years ago and their first videos sucked, or their first podcast sucked, or the first stuff they wrote sucked. But they persevered. They had that beginner's mindset of, I'm just going to start. I'm going to accept that I suck and I'll get better. And again, same with software. I still meet people say, John, how do you know so much about software? It's like, well, I'm 47. I started writing code when I was 9. I've been
Yeah.
doing it for many, many years. I started writing code professionally at 19. It's just a lot of practice. I sucked, and I've still got some of the code I wrote when I was 9, and it is abysmal. So is a lot of the code I wrote at 19. Even if I look at code I wrote 10 years ago, I'll still look at it and think, God, really? Which
Yeah.
idiot wrote that? But it's
Oh, it
that
was me.
consistent practice, isn't it?
Yeah. And
And,
that's
we can
exactly it.
all get there.
Yeah, and again, it's not a knock on them. I've actually, so there's 2 people individually, or in particular, my words are not working today. 2 people in particular, I focus on. A lot of my content is for C# and .NET developers. I do want to shift more into, I put out a lot of general software engineering topics, just because for me that's more important, and I want to continue to shift that direction because I feel like truly that's where my value is. But I feel like a lot of my audience is like, we want the C sharp, we want the .NET. So I do continue to deliver there. But there's two YouTubers in particular, Nick Chapsis and Milan Jovanovic, and they've been doing it. I remember it was either Nick or Milan talking about how they had, at the time I was watching it, had been like, yeah, I've been doing this for like between 5 and 7 years. And I remember thinking, if I would have just kept going, I would have had years on these guys.
Yeah.
Not to say that I would be better or anything else, but look what they did in that much time. And if you were just consistent, like, don't you think that you would be somewhere? And I said, like, so that's the thing that's driving me is like, I feel like I had this opportunity to be kind of sharing knowledge, kind of learning in public and having people critique things, which is hard to hear, but putting information out there and having people be like, hey, have you thought about it this way? That's usually the way that doesn't hurt so bad. And just having so much learning opportunity where I'm like, you got to catch up. Like, you have this 10-year window where you should have been doing this, can't go back in time. So make sure that you stay consistent, because I don't want another 10 years to go by where I'm like, why weren't you leaning into this? There's a lot of opportunity.
Yeah. It's the same with everything, isn't it? Start today, accept that you might suck, and then just be consistent. Keep going.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's
awesome. I've taken up a
consistency.
lot of time, Nick. We've run over. So where can people find out more? Where can they find your YouTube channel and your newsletter?
For sure. Yeah.
And
So,
you?
yeah, my brand that I go by is Dev Leader, and that stemmed again because I was trying to do a blend between development and leadership. You know, getting into being a new engineering manager. So I am on every platform. If you know of one that I'm not, please let me know. But I go by Dev Leader on everything. So on YouTube, it is Dev Leader. LinkedIn, you can find me just Nick Cosentino. There's not too many of us. But yeah, if people want, they can reach out to me on any platform. I'm happy to have a chat. And yeah, my newsletter is
Awesome.
Dev Leader Weekly. So
cool. And we'll stick all the links in the show notes as well.
cool
Right,
stuff.
thanks very much for your time, Nick.
Thank you.